Sometimes the kindest heart pays the highest price, and on one cold evening beneath the fading Arizona sky, one desperate choice changed 2 lives forever. The dusty trading post stood at the edge of the frontier where frightened horses stamped against the dry earth, and tired travelers avoided looking too closely at the small gathering near the wooden corral. Ethan Carter stood quietly with his hands bound by rough rope, not because he had committed any crime, but because he had refused to abandon a frightened immigrant family whose wagon had been unfairly seized by dishonest traders. Rather than argue, the men had declared that Ethan owed them a debt they had invented themselves. There were no judges in that lonely place, only men with loud voices and frightened witnesses who chose silence over truth. Ethan kept his head high as the late afternoon sun settled behind distant red mesas. Dust clung to his worn leather jacket. His brown hat rested on the ground several feet away, and the familiar scent of horses mixed with cedar smoke drifting from nearby cabins. He believed someone would eventually recognize the injustice. No one did. Travelers passed without speaking. Merchants counted coins without lifting their eyes. Even the wind seemed unwilling to interrupt the heavy silence. Then another rider entered the settlement. She wore traditional Apache buckskin clothing beneath a woven blanket. Her long black braided hair moved gently with the evening breeze, and calm brown eyes studied every face before resting upon the quiet cowboy standing beside the corral. Her name was Ayanna. She had come only to purchase medicine and supplies for her grandfather before returning to her village hidden among the mountains. She knew nothing about the stranger before her, yet something inside her refused to accept what she was seeing. She stepped toward the trader and asked one simple question. "Why is that man standing there?" The merchant shrugged carelessly. "He belongs to whoever settles his debt." Ayanna looked directly at Ethan. He did not ask for help. He did not plead. He simply met her eyes with quiet dignity, the kind carried by people who had already accepted hardship without allowing it to change who they were. After several long moments, Ayanna slowly untied the small leather pouch hanging from her belt. Inside rested nearly every silver coin her family had saved across many seasons to purchase livestock before winter. Without hesitation, she placed the pouch upon the wooden counter. The merchant greedily counted every coin before cutting the rope around Ethan's wrists. "He is free," the man announced with a satisfied smile. Ethan stared at Ayanna in complete disbelief. "You should not have done that," he said softly. She answered with calm honesty. "No person should be traded like property." Night settled across the frontier as they began riding toward the Apache mountains beneath countless stars. Neither spoke for many miles. The only sounds came from hoofbeats against the rocky trail and the distant cry of a lonely coyote echoing across the valley. When they finally reached the village, welcoming fires burned beside every home, and elders quietly watched the 2 travelers arrive together. Ayanna led Ethan to a small guest lodge before turning toward him with gentle eyes that revealed both kindness and quiet concern. She lowered her voice until only he could hear. "There is something you must know before sunrise." Ethan waited silently. She drew one slow breath before speaking words that made the entire journey suddenly feel far more complicated than either of them had imagined. "Our people will believe that because I purchased your freedom, you are now the man who must become my husband." Edit. Ayanna left the small guest lodge before dawn, but sleep never came easily to Ethan after hearing her quiet confession beneath the stars. The gentle crackling of nearby campfires drifted through the wooden walls while cool mountain air carried the scent of cedar, sage, and fresh pine into the silent room. He sat alone on the edge of the simple bed, turning his weathered cowboy hat slowly in his hands, trying to understand how one act of kindness had somehow led him into a future he had never imagined. He respected the woman who had sacrificed everything to secure his freedom, yet the thought that another person believed his life could now belong to someone else unsettled him deeply. As the first rays of sunlight touched the surrounding cliffs, voices gradually filled the village. Children laughed while chasing one another between the cottonwood trees. Women prepared breakfast over open fires. Horses wandered peacefully near the stream, and elderly men greeted the morning with quiet conversation beneath the broad branches of an ancient tree standing at the center of the village. Nothing about the peaceful settlement matched the fearful stories Ethan had heard growing up. Instead of suspicion, he found order. Instead of anger, he found quiet dignity. A gentle knock sounded upon the cabin door. Ayana entered carrying warm bread and a wooden cup filled with fresh herbal tea. She noticed the concern resting across Ethan's face before offering a small, understanding smile. "You have many questions," she said softly. Ethan nodded. "I do not want your people believing something that is not true." Ayana placed the food upon the table before sitting across from him. "Neither do I." Her answer surprised him. Before he could speak again, an elderly man slowly approached the open doorway. His long silver hair rested against a finely woven blanket, and his carved walking staff reflected years of careful craftsmanship. Ayana immediately stood with respect. "Grandfather Takoda." The old man greeted Ethan with calm eyes that carried neither judgment nor expectation. "Our village thanks you for accepting our hospitality," he said gently. Ethan answered honestly. "Your granddaughter saved my life. I owe her more than I can repay, but I cannot allow anyone to believe I belong to another person." The elder smiled faintly, almost as though he had expected those exact words. "Come walk with me." Together they crossed the village while morning sunlight painted the surrounding mountains in shades of gold and red. Families greeted the elder with quiet respect, and Ethan noticed that no one looked at him with hostility. Curious eyes followed him, certainly, but they carried kindness instead of suspicion. They eventually stopped beside a clear spring flowing between smooth stones polished by countless seasons. Takoda rested both hands upon his walking staff before speaking. "Long ago, during years when our people often rescued travelers from dangerous places, a custom was born. If someone gave away everything they owned to save another life, the rescued person remained under that family's protection until a council could hear the truth. Outsiders remembered only one small part of that tradition. They forgot the reason it existed." Ethan listened carefully. "Then I am not being forced into marriage." The elder slowly shook his head. "No honorable tradition should imprison a grateful heart. The old custom protects dignity. It cannot command love." Relief quietly settled across Ethan's face, yet another concern remained. "Then why did Ayana tell me those words last night?" Takoda looked toward the distant hills where morning light touched the valley. "Because many people outside this village still believe the old stories without understanding them. She feared someone else would tell you first." Before Ethan could answer, a young rider came racing into the village from the direction of the trading post. His horse stopped in a cloud of dust near the gathering. Breathless, he handed a folded letter to Elder Takoda before speaking only one sentence. "The merchants have already begun spreading a different version of what happened." The elder unfolded the paper slowly, and by the following morning, the peaceful rhythm of the Apache village continued as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet Ethan sensed that every quiet conversation now carried the weight of the letter brought by the young rider. The rumor had traveled faster than any horse could run. According to merchants in the nearby settlements, an Apache woman had purchased a white cowboy as though he were property and forced him into marriage under an ancient tribal law. Every part of the story ignored the truth, yet false stories often traveled farther because they required less courage to believe. Ethan stood beside the small stable repairing a loose wooden gate when Ayana arrived leading a gray mare whose saddle needed new leather straps. She placed the reins into his hands with a gentle smile. "Grandfather said you know horses better than anyone who has visited this valley." Ethan smiled for the first time since reaching the village. A horse usually tells the truth. People do not always make that choice. Together they examined the worn saddle, while morning sunlight filtered through tall cottonwood branches above them. The scent of fresh pine mixed with leather and cedar smoke drifting from nearby homes. Children laughed beside the creek while older men shaped wagon wheels and younger women prepared woven blankets for trade. Ethan quietly noticed how every person worked for the benefit of someone else. Nothing here resembled the stories told in frontier saloons. As he repaired the saddle, several young boys gathered nearby, watching every careful movement with wide, curious eyes. One finally asked whether all cowboys truly slept beneath the stars every night. Ethan laughed softly before showing them how to oil leather properly, so it would survive another season beneath the Arizona sun. Within minutes, the children were helping him tighten straps and polish buckles. Ayana watched from a short distance, surprised by how naturally he fit among people he had only met the day before. Later that afternoon, she invited Ethan to accompany her into the foothills where several older horses grazed freely. The narrow trail wound between towering red cliffs, flowering cactus, and scattered juniper trees as warm desert wind carried the scent of sage across the valley. Along the way, she explained how her family cared for injured animals before releasing them back to the herd. Ethan listened carefully, recognizing the same quiet respect for life that had guided his own father many years earlier. They stopped beside a clear spring where the horses drank peacefully beneath overhanging branches. Neither hurried to speak. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "Why did you spend everything you owned to help someone you had never met?" Ayana looked toward the flowing water before answering. "Because once, when I was a little girl, a stranger helped my mother during a winter storm and refused every reward she offered. My grandfather taught me that kindness becomes worthless if we save it only for people we already know." Ethan lowered his eyes, quietly absorbing her words. Before he could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed through the canyon. A messenger from a neighboring ranch dismounted quickly and handed Ethan a folded newspaper from Dry Creek. Across the front page appeared a bold headline describing him as the captive husband of an Apache woman. Several details had already been twisted into entertainment for readers who had never met either of them. Ethan slowly folded the paper without anger. "They have turned your kindness into a spectacle." Ayana looked at the headline only briefly before returning her attention to the valley stretching peacefully below. "Then we will answer with the truth." Ethan nodded. "Words alone may not be enough." She smiled with quiet confidence. "No, but lives honestly lived usually speak much louder." As the evening sun painted the mountains gold, Ethan realized that leaving immediately would allow the lie to grow stronger. For the first time since arriving, he made a decision entirely on his own. He would remain in the valley, not because of any tradition, debt, or expectation, but because the woman who had rescued him deserved someone willing to stand beside the truth before the entire frontier. The decision to remain in the valley quietly changed the rhythm of every passing day. Ethan no longer woke wondering how quickly he could leave. Instead, each sunrise found him standing beside the small stable before the first light reached the mountain peaks, repairing broken tack, checking horses, and helping young riders learn how to calm nervous animals without fear or force. The work was simple, yet every task slowly erased another false story he had once believed about the Apache people. He discovered that patience was valued more than pride, that every tool was repaired before being replaced, and that every child was taught to protect both people and the land with equal respect. Ayana spent her mornings caring for her grandfather, preparing medicinal herbs gathered from the surrounding hills, and organizing supplies for families who lived farther into the mountains. Whenever Ethan offered to help, she accepted naturally, never treating him as someone who owed her anything. That quiet honesty made him trust her even more. One afternoon, they rode together to deliver blankets and medicine to an elderly couple living several miles beyond the village. Warm desert wind swept across the open grasslands while hawks circled high above the cliffs. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It had become the silence shared by people learning to understand one another without needing many words. As they returned through a narrow canyon, they found several ranchers struggling to move a heavily loaded wagon whose wheel had become trapped between large stones after a recent rainstorm. The ranchers immediately recognized Ethan and stared with surprise as he approached beside an Apache woman. One man lowered his voice. So the stories were true. Ethan stepped down from his horse without showing anger. Only the smallest part. Instead of arguing, he gathered fallen branches, shaped a simple support beneath the wheel, and asked Ayana to steady the frightened draft horses while the ranchers pushed together. Within minutes, the wagon rolled safely back onto solid ground. The oldest rancher removed his hat with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," he said, looking first at Ethan and then at Ayana. She simply smiled. Neighbors help neighbors. The men watched the two riders disappear down the trail, clearly uncertain whether the rumors they had heard deserved any further belief. By evening, word of the shared rescue had already reached Dry Creek, but it arrived beside another story, one that described a cowboy and an Apache woman helping strangers without asking who they were. Not everyone welcomed the change. Inside the largest trading office in town, Merchant Calvin Briggs slowly folded the newspaper carrying the latest account. He had expected gossip to divide the valley, not unite it. If people stopped fearing one another, convincing county officials to approve his new freight route through Apache land would become far more difficult. Standing beside a large map spread across his polished desk, he quietly told his business partners, "If kindness keeps bringing those people together, we will lose far more than one road." The following morning, an official notice arrived at the village requesting that Apache elders, nearby ranchers, and Ethan himself attend a public meeting in Dry Creek concerning recent events and the proposed mountain route. Elder Takota read the letter carefully before handing it to Ethan. "Some meetings decide land," he said softly. "Others decide whether neighbors remain strangers." Ethan looked toward Ayanna, who stood beneath the cottonwood tree gently feeding her gray mare. She met his eyes with calm confidence that asked for no promises. Ethan folded the notice and slipped it inside his jacket. He understood that the journey ahead would not be won through louder voices or stronger hands. It would depend upon whether ordinary people could recognize the truth after hearing so many comfortable lies. And as the first evening shadows stretched across the valley, he quietly realized that the greatest test of his courage had not happened at the trading post. It was waiting for him inside the meeting hall in Dry Creek. Morning sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Dry Creek meeting hall, casting long golden beams across polished wooden floors worn smooth by generations of boots and wagon wheels. Ranchers filled the front rows beside shopkeepers. County officials arranged maps across a heavy oak table, and Apache elders quietly entered together with calm dignity that drew respectful silence from the crowd. Ethan walked beside Elder Takota while Ayanna followed only a few steps behind, carrying a small leather pouch that once held the silver coin she had sacrificed to purchase a stranger's freedom. The room carried the familiar scent of pine lumber, leather, fresh coffee, and dry desert dust drifting through open windows. At the far end of the hall, Merchant Calvin Briggs welcomed everyone with polished confidence. His expensive black coat and spotless boots reflected success, yet his pleasant smile seemed carefully practiced rather than sincere. He thanked the county officials before unfolding a large survey map across the table. A thick red line crossed directly through the valley where the Apache village had stood for generations. "This freight route," he explained smoothly, "will shorten travel by nearly 15 miles, increase commerce, and create prosperity for every settlement in this territory." Several businessmen nodded with quiet approval. Before anyone else could speak, Calvin casually turned toward Ethan. "Unfortunately, recent events involving a captive cowboy and tribal marriage customs have created uncertainty that must also be considered." Soft whispers immediately spread throughout the room. Ethan slowly stepped forward without raising his voice. "There was never a captive husband," he said calmly. "There was only one woman who spent everything she owned to free a man who had been treated unjustly." Calvin smiled politely. "That is one version." Elder Takota arose from his chair before the merchant could continue. His weathered hands rested gently upon his carved cedar staff, while complete silence settled across the hall. "Then perhaps today everyone should hear the entire truth." He motioned for Ayanna to stand beside him. She opened the small leather pouch and carefully poured several worn silver coins onto the wooden table. Every coin bore scratches from years of honest work. "These coins were saved across many seasons so our family could purchase 2 breeding mares before winter," she said softly. "Instead, I exchanged them for another person's freedom because no human life should ever be measured by money." Her quiet words carried farther than any angry speech. Ethan then removed the folded newspaper from his jacket and placed it beside the coins. "This paper says I became someone's property," he continued. "It does not mention that I was already free the moment she chose compassion." County officials studied both the coins and the newspaper without speaking. One elderly rancher slowly stood from the back of the room. "I watched that cowboy help my wagon after the spring storm," he said. Another merchant added, "The Apache village repaired broken wagons without asking for payment." Soon several voices offered similar stories describing cooperation instead of conflict. Calvin's confident expression slowly faded, as every witness quietly replaced rumor with personal experience. Finally, Elder Takota spoke again. "Our custom has never required love. It has never forced marriage. Long ago, it simply placed rescued travelers beneath a family's protection until truth could be heard. Honor protects freedom. It never steals it. The county chairman looked carefully around the room before folding the survey map. Then we have allowed gossip to shape decisions that should have been guided by facts. He announced that the proposed road would remain suspended until an independent survey involving both communities could be completed together. Calvin lowered his eyes, realizing his carefully planned division had begun quietly slipping away. As the meeting ended, Ethan picked up the small leather pouch and gently returned it to Ayanna. She smiled but did not take it. "Keep it until the truth finishes its journey," she whispered. Ethan looked around the crowded hall where strangers had begun speaking with neighbors instead of arguing across old boundaries. He slipped the pouch carefully inside his jacket, understanding that its true value had never been measured by silver. It had become the quiet proof that one selfless decision possessed the power to change hearts long before it changed laws. Ivy remained by the window long after the last rider disappeared beyond the rolling hills. The ranch had fallen quiet again, but it was not the same silence that had wrapped itself around the valley before dawn. This silence carried memory. It carried choices. It carried the weight of promises that could no longer be ignored. Ethan stepped onto the porch with 2 steaming cups of black coffee. He handed one to her without speaking. The warmth settled into her hands before either of them found the courage to look at the other. The morning breeze swept across the open pasture, bending the tall grass in slow waves while the cattle wandered as though the world had never stood on the edge of breaking apart. "They trusted you," Ivy finally whispered. Ethan stared toward the distant mountains where the blue ridges touched the sky. "No," he answered after a long pause. "They trusted what I chose to do. When nobody was watching." His words lingered between them. Ivy understood there was a difference. Reputation belonged to the world. Character belonged only to the quiet moments. She lowered her eyes toward the small leather pouch resting on the porch railing. The elder had left it behind without explanation. Ethan untied the worn leather cord and slowly opened it. Inside rested several polished turquoise stones wrapped around an old silver badge, its edges softened by years of careful handling. Beneath them lay a folded piece of faded paper. The handwriting had nearly vanished, but one sentence remained clear enough to read. "A debt repaid should become a kindness passed forward." Ethan folded the paper with gentle hands. He recognized the badge immediately. It had belonged to Marshal Benjamin Carter, the man who had once protected travelers regardless of the color of their skin. Ethan remembered hearing stories as a boy about how the old marshal believed fairness was stronger than fear. Somehow, after all those years, the badge had found its way back into his hands. Ivy looked at him with quiet surprise. "Why would they leave this with you?" Ethan smiled, though sadness rested behind his eyes. "Because symbols only matter when someone is willing to live by them." The afternoon sun climbed higher as neighbors slowly approached the ranch. Some came carrying fresh bread. Others brought lumber to repair the damaged fence. No speeches were made. No one apologized with dramatic words. A rancher silently replaced broken rails. An elderly widow filled the kitchen shelves with jars of preserved peaches. Even the young blacksmith who had once avoided Ethan's greeting removed his hat before offering a firm handshake. Small action spoke louder than regret ever could. Ivy watched every face carefully. Yesterday, those same people had stood at a safe distance, uncertain which side deserved their loyalty. Today, they simply worked together beneath the same endless sky. The change felt almost impossible, yet nobody questioned it. As evening painted the valley in soft shades of gold, Ethan walked toward the highest hill overlooking the ranch. He carried the old silver badge in one hand and the folded letter in the other. Behind him came the quiet sounds of neighbors rebuilding what fear had almost destroyed. Far beyond the western ridge, an eagle circled once before disappearing into the fading light. Ethan slipped the badge into his coat pocket instead of displaying it on his chest. Some honors did not need to be seen. They only needed to guide the next decision when another stranger arrived carrying nothing except hope. 3 mornings later, the valley welcomed the first real rain in nearly a month. Gentle drops settled across the thirsty earth, releasing the familiar scent of wet soil that every rancher recognized before they even opened their eyes. Ethan stood beneath the barn roof listening to the quiet rhythm falling across the wooden shingles. It sounded less like weather and more like a promise finally keeping its word. Ivy walked toward him carrying the old leather pouch. She had polished the turquoise stones until they reflected the pale morning light. "I thought these belonged inside the house," she said softly. Ethan shook his head. "Some things belong where every traveler can see them." Together they placed the pouch on a small shelf beside the front door. No lock, no glass case, just weathered wood and open air. Anyone passing the ranch would notice the simple collection before noticing the ranch itself. By noon, a covered wagon rolled slowly up the narrow trail. An elderly couple climbed down, their boots heavy with mud from several days on the road. Their horses looked tired, and one wheel leaned at an awkward angle. The old man removed his hat with quiet dignity. "We heard this ranch helps strangers without asking too many questions." Ethan glanced toward Ivy before smiling. "Depends on the stranger." The old woman laughed for the first time in what sounded like many difficult weeks. They spent the afternoon repairing the broken wagon together. Ivy prepared hot stew while Ethan replaced the cracked wheel with spare lumber from the barn. The elderly man reached into his coat several times as though preparing to offer payment, but Ethan gently raised one hand each time. "Save your money for the next town. Roads have a way of demanding more than people expect." As the sun drifted lower, the couple prepared to leave. Before climbing back onto the wagon, the old woman quietly placed something beside the turquoise stones on the porch shelf. It was a small silver thimble worn smooth from years of careful sewing. Ivy hurried after her. "Ma'am, you forgot this." The woman smiled without turning around. "No, dear. That little thimble mended every shirt my husband ever wore. Maybe it will remind someone else that broken things are usually worth fixing." The wagon disappeared into the golden distance while the silver thimble rested beside the turquoise stones. Ethan looked at the growing collection and understood what was happening. None of the visitors were leaving money. They were leaving pieces of their own stories. A ranch that had once been known only for loneliness was quietly becoming a place where burdens grew lighter before the next mile began. Several days later, the young blacksmith returned carrying a wooden frame he had built by hand. Without asking permission, he mounted it beside the porch. Across the top, he carved a simple sentence. "Leave what you can. Take only what you truly need." Ivy traced the letters with her fingertips. "People will come because of this." Ethan watched another line of dust rise far beyond the eastern ridge. A single rider approached at an unhurried pace, leading 2 extra horses behind him. The figure remained too distant to recognize. Yet something about the calm rhythm of the approaching animals made Ethan rest one hand against the old silver badge hidden inside his coat. He did not feel worry. He felt readiness. Because kindness had begun traveling these roads faster than fear ever could. The rider reached the ranch just before sunset, guiding the 2 spare horses with the patience of someone who had traveled many lonely miles. Dust covered his boots, his coat, even the brim of his weathered hat. Yet his eyes carried a calm certainty that immediately reminded Ethan of the old elder who had first changed the direction of this valley. Without a word, the traveler tied the horses beside the fence and removed a folded piece of paper from his saddlebag. He offered it with both hands. Ethan unfolded the letter carefully. The handwriting belonged to the tribal elder. The message was short. "You taught your neighbors what we hoped they would remember. Continue. Nothing more. Nothing less." Ethan folded the paper and slipped it beside the old marshal's letter inside his coat. Some messages never needed many words. Ivy welcomed the traveler inside while supper simmered over the iron stove. They shared warm bread, beans, and fresh coffee as evening settled across the prairie. No one rushed the conversation. Outside, crickets filled the quiet spaces with their steady song, while lantern light danced softly across the cabin walls. Before dawn, the traveler prepared to leave. He thanked them with a simple nod, mounted one horse, and left the other 2 behind. Ethan stepped forward. "You forgot your horses." The traveler smiled. "No. Someone farther down this trail will need them more than I do." Then he disappeared into the pale morning mist before another word could be spoken. Weeks became months. Seasons slowly painted the valley with new colors. Travelers stopped at the ranch so often that the porch shelf no longer held only turquoise stones and a silver thimble. A child's carved wooden bird rested beside a faded military button. A worn pocket watch missing its hands lay beside a carefully folded ribbon. Every object carried a story. Every story began with someone who had once believed they stood alone. The ranch itself changed very little. The fences remained simple. The barn still leaned slightly toward the west. Ethan never accepted money for kindness, and Ivy never counted how many strangers shared their table. Somehow there was always enough bread. Somehow there was always another chair waiting beside the fire. One crisp autumn afternoon, a group of children from the nearby settlement wandered onto the porch while their parents repaired a wagon wheel. They stared curiously at the growing collection. One little boy pointed toward the turquoise stones. "Who owns all these things?" Ethan looked across the open pasture where the wind rolled through the tall grass like waves across a quiet sea. He smiled before answering. "Nobody owns them anymore. They belong to every person who still believes a good deed can travel farther than a horse." The children nodded as though the answer made perfect sense. Before leaving, the smallest girl carefully placed a single wildflower onto the shelf. It was already beginning to fade beneath the afternoon sun, yet nobody moved it. Some gifts were valuable because they could not last forever. As darkness settled over the valley, Ethan and Ivy stood side by side on the porch watching the first stars appear above the endless western sky. The old silver badge remained hidden inside his coat. The letters rested safely beside it. Neither needed to be displayed. The ranch no longer stood as proof that one man had earned respect. It stood quietly as proof that compassion could outlive fear, out-travel anger, and pass from one pair of steady hands to another until even the loneliest road no longer felt empty. Years passed so quietly that even the oldest cottonwood beside the creek seemed surprised by how much the valley had changed without anyone noticing. Children who had once arrived holding their parents' hands now returned as grown men and women with families of their own. They always stopped at the same porch before continuing west. Some came searching for directions. Others came searching for courage. Few realized they were looking for both. Ethan's hair had turned the color of fresh winter snow, while Ivy's gentle smile carried the same warmth that had welcomed strangers on the very first day. The porch shelf had become too small long ago. Ethan built another beside it, then another after that. Turquoise stones rested beside polished horseshoes, tiny carved animals, folded letters, faded ribbons, old family photographs, and countless simple treasures that would have meant nothing inside a store, but meant everything to the people who had left them behind. One cold evening, a young rancher arrived with worry written across his face. His crops had failed twice. His neighbors argued over water. He believed kindness had become too expensive in difficult times. Ethan listened without interrupting. When the young man finished speaking, Ethan silently handed him the old silver badge. The rancher studied it with wide eyes. "Are you giving this to me?" Ethan smiled and slowly shook his head. "No, I am reminding you that it never belonged to me." Confusion crossed the young man's face. Ethan gently pointed toward every object resting on the shelves. None of these belonged to the people who carried them here. They belonged to the choices that brought them. The young rancher remained silent for a long moment before carefully placing the badge back into Ethan's weathered hand. He understood. Before leaving, he removed his own leatherwork gloves and placed them beside the silver thimble and the turquoise stones. "Someone else will need these more than I will one day," he quietly said. Ethan watched him disappear down the dusty trail with lighter shoulders than when he had arrived. Ivy slipped her hand into Ethan's as evening settled across the prairie. Neither of them spoke. They simply listened to the wind passing through the tall grass, carrying distant laughter from children playing near the creek. The sound blended with birds returning to their nests and cattle settling beneath the fading light. It was the kind of peace that could never be purchased because it had been earned one generous decision at a time. Long after Ethan and Ivy were gone, travelers still found the old ranch. The buildings weathered. The fences aged. The porch boards creaked beneath countless boots. Yet the shelves remained. New hands continued adding small reminders that compassion had once lived there and had refused to leave when the people themselves finally rested. Some visitors never learned the names of the rancher and the woman who had welcomed strangers without asking where they came from or what they believed. They only remembered that someone had offered warm food before questions, honest respect before judgment, and hope before fear. On quiet evenings, the valley still carried the scent of fresh coffee, rain-soaked earth, worn leather, and wood smoke drifting through the cool western air. People often said the place felt different, though nobody could explain why. Perhaps the answer had always been simple. A single act of goodness never truly ends. It changes hands. It crosses rivers. It survives seasons. It waits patiently for the next ordinary person willing to choose mercy over suspicion. And somewhere beyond the endless horizon, where the last light settled gently over the open range, the road continued forward, carrying that quiet choice into another life, another family, and another story waiting to begin.